In the parched summer of 1888, the Wyoming sky, a merciless bowl of blue, began to bruise with the color of a deep purple plum, promising a storm that would be spoken of for years. On the horizon, a lone figure on a weary horse pushed against the rising wind. This was Jebediah, a man whose face was a roadmap of disappointments, etched with lines of solitude. He wasn't just riding away from the encroaching storm, but from a past that clung to him like the very dust now choking the air, a past that was about to find him in the most unexpected of ways. As the first fat drops of rain, heavy as coins, began to strike the thirsty earth, Jebediah felt the familiar pull of his isolation. His homestead was his fortress, built to keep the world out. But the world, in all its desperation, was about to come knocking. The figure he would soon find, collapsed at his fence line, wouldn't just be a person seeking shelter. She would be a mirror reflecting a piece of his soul he thought he had buried 2 decades ago. Her arrival would force him to choose between the safety of his solitude and the dangerous, uncertain path of humanity. What do you think you would do in his place? Let us know in the comments, and if you enjoy stories that dig deep into the heart of the Old West, make sure you subscribe to our channel. The wind howled a mournful song as Jebediah fought to latch the groaning barn door. It was then he saw her, a ghost spat out by the storm. A young Cheyenne woman, her dark hair plastered to her face, buckskin clothes torn and muddied, stumbled and fell in a heap not 50 yards from his cabin. Beyond her, almost swallowed by the swirling brown haze, was another cloud of dust, riders, moving with the predatory certainty of a posse. Jebediah's heart, a dormant, stony thing, thumped a hard, painful rhythm against his ribs. Every instinct screamed at him to bolt the door, to pretend he'd seen nothing. Trouble was a currency he no longer traded in. He had paid his dues to sorrow and had nothing left to give. Yet he couldn't tear his eyes away from her crumpled form. He saw the slight rise and fall of her back, a fragile testament to the life still flickering within. The riders were getting closer, with a curse that was swallowed by the wind. A curse directed at the heavens, at the posse, and mostly at himself. Jebediah threw the barn door open again and ran into the maelstrom, his decision a rebellion against the man he had become. He dragged her into the cavernous, hay-scented dark of the barn, just as the world outside dissolved into a symphony of chaos. The rain came down in solid sheets, turning the dust to thick running mud. The woman, whose name he would learn was Ayanna, was light in his arms, her body radiating a feverish heat. He laid her on a pile of clean straw in an empty stall, her breath coming in shallow rasps. A nasty gash on her forehead was bleeding sluggishly, and her ankle was twisted at an unnatural angle. Before he could do more, a thunderous pounding rattled the main door of his cabin. It wasn't the storm. It was them. He peered through a crack in the barn wall, his body rigid. 4 riders, their faces obscured by rain-soaked bandanas, sat on their horses, their leader hammering on his door with the butt of a pistol. Jebediah's mind raced. He moved silently, grabbing an old stained canvas and draping it over the stall, plunging Ayanna into deeper shadow. He took a deep breath, schooling his features into a mask of weary annoyance, and stalked from the barn to the cabin. He swung the door open, letting the wind and rain whip inside. "What in God's name do you want?" he bellowed over the storm. The man at the front, broad and bull-necked with a tin star pinned crookedly to his duster, leaned down from his horse. This was Sheriff Thorne, a man whose reputation for cruelty preceded him. "We're tracking a Cheyenne fugitive!" Thorne yelled back, his eyes small and hard as pebbles, scanning the dark interior of Jebediah's cabin. A murderous little thing, part of the band that hit the Miller settlement. "Seen anyone?" Jebediah met his gaze without flinching. "I've seen nothing but rain and dust for the past 3 hours. Now get off my property before you spook my livestock." Thorne's gaze lingered, sharp and suspicious, before he grunted. "If you see her, you'll know. And you'll let me know. There's a price on her head, and a bigger one for anyone who helps her." The posse turned and rode on, swallowed by the storm as quickly as they had appeared. Jebediah slammed the door, his hand trembling slightly. He had crossed a line, and he knew there was no going back. Returning to the barn, he found Ayanna conscious, her dark eyes wide and full of a terror that needed no translation. He knelt, offering a canteen of water. She flinched, but her thirst was too great. As she drank, their eyes met over the metal rim, and in that silent, storm-lashed moment, an unwilling pact was forged between two solitary souls. The following days were a study in silence, a delicate dance of mistrust and necessity. The storm had broken, leaving behind a world washed clean and deceptively peaceful. Jebediah wordlessly left food and fresh water by the stall door, and Ayanna, in turn, would leave the empty plate and cup neatly stacked. He watched her from a distance as he did his chores. He saw how she expertly fashioned a splint for her swollen ankle from a broken bucket stave and strips of her own torn clothing. He saw her tending to the gash on her forehead with a poultice made from leaves she'd pointed out to him, nodding toward a patch of yarrow growing near the creek. Her resourcefulness was a quiet rebuke to the savage Thorn had described. She moved with a purpose and a grace that belied her injuries, her silence a heavy cloak of dignity. Sometimes he'd hear her humming a low, sorrowful tune, a sound that snagged at something deep inside him, a painful echo of a lullaby he had not heard in 20 years. The fragments of his past, long buried under the weight of grief and isolation, began to stir. He started to see things, not just the injured woman in his barn, but the intricate beading on her worn moccasin, a pattern of a bluebird that his wife Sarah had loved. He dismissed it as a coincidence, a trick of a lonely mind. Yet the feeling grew, an unsettling sense of familiarity that made his skin prickle. He became more protective, his gaze often drifting to the horizon, watching for the dust cloud that would signal Thorn's return. He taught her the English word for water, and she, in return, taught him the hand sign for gratitude. It was a start, a tiny bridge across a chasm of culture and fear. He was beginning to see not a fugitive, but a young woman fighting for her life, and this realization began to chip away at the fortress he had built around his heart. The silence in his home was no longer empty. It was filled with her presence, a presence that was both a comfort and a torment. A week after the storm, supplies ran low. Jebediah knew he couldn't put off a trip to Redemption any longer. He saddled his horse at dawn, leaving Ayanna with a small pistol he hadn't touched in years, and a stern, mimed warning to use it if necessary. She had watched him, her expression unreadable, and gave a single sharp nod. The 2-hour ride felt like an eternity, his mind churning with anxieties. The town of Redemption was little more than a single dusty street, lined with false-fronted buildings, baked into submission by the relentless sun. As he tied his horse outside the general store, he felt the familiar weight of eyes on him. In a town this small, a recluse like Jebediah was a constant source of speculation, and his sudden appearance was an event. Inside, the air was thick with the smells of coffee, leather, and suspicion. Sheriff Thorn was leaning against the counter, a toothpick dangling from his lips. He straightened up as Jebediah entered, a lazy smirk on his face. "Well, look what the storm blew in," Thorn drawled, his voice carrying through the quiet store. "Decided to rejoin civilization, Jebediah?" Jebediah ignored him. Handing his list to the portly store owner, Mr. Henderson, he asked for flour, salt, coffee, and then hesitated. "And a bolt of that blue calico fabric. Some bandages and carbolic soap." Henderson's eyebrows shot up. Thorn's smirk widened into a predatory grin. "Getting into sewing, Jebediah? Or maybe you've got a guest." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I told you there's a reward. All you have to do is say the word. No one has to know you held out for a week." Pinned to the wall behind Thorn was a crudely drawn wanted poster. "Wanted, Cheyenne squaw, for the murder of the Miller family." Beneath the words was a sketch that, despite its poor quality, was unmistakably Ayanna. Jebediah felt a cold fury rise in his throat. He looked from the poster to Thorn's smug face. "I told you," he said, his voice low and even. "I haven't seen anyone." He paid for his goods, keenly aware of the silence, of the unblinking stares of the other patrons. As he loaded his saddlebags, Thorn followed him out. "You're a fool, old man. You're either with this town or you're against it. Don't make the wrong choice." Jebediah mounted his horse and rode away without a word, Thorn's threat hanging in the hot, still air. He knew then that his choice had already been made. Back at the homestead, the tense quiet he'd left had been replaced by a different kind of stillness. Ayanna was not in the barn. A knot of panic tightened in Jebediah's chest. He found her by the creek, carefully washing the meager clothes she possessed. He set down the supplies, wordlessly placing the bolt of blue calico on a clean, flat rock beside her. Her eyes widened slightly, her gaze flicking from the fabric to his face, a silent question in their depths. As he turned to leave, his foot caught on a root, sending him stumbling. He reached out to steady himself, his hand inadvertently knocking over the small deerskin pouch that held her few belongings. The contents scattered across the ground, a smooth river stone, a braided bundle of sweetgrass, and a small object that glinted in the afternoon sun. It was a silver locket, tarnished with age on a delicate broken chain. Jebediah froze, the air leaving his lungs in a rush. He had seen that locket before. His hand trembled as he reached down and picked it up. The clasp was stiff, but it gave way under his thumb. Inside, protected under a sliver of yellowed glass, was a miniature portrait, a faded sepia image of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. It was Sarah, his Sarah, the world tilted on its axis. 20 years since he'd held this locket, since he'd placed it around his wife's neck on their wedding day. He had buried her with it, or so he had thought. 1,000 impossible questions crashed through his mind. How? Why? He looked at Ayanna, who was now staring at him, her face a mask of alarm at the sudden violent shift in his demeanor. "Where did you get this?" He choked out, the words raw and rusty from his throat. He held it out to her, his hand shaking. She didn't understand the words, but she understood his tone. She scrambled back, snatching the locket from his grasp and clutching it to her chest, as if protecting it from a thief. For the first time, Jebediah saw not just fear in her eyes, but a fierce, defiant ownership. This object, which held the ghost of his entire life, was somehow her most prized possession. The mystery of the woman in his barn had just deepened into an abyss. The discovery of the locket shattered the fragile peace between them. An agonizing tension filled the homestead for 2 days. Jebediah was haunted, pacing his cabin like a caged animal, while Ayanna remained in the barn, watchful and wary. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, Jebediah approached her, not with anger, but with a palpable desperation. He sat on the ground across from her, took a stick, and drew a crude picture of the locket in the dirt. He pointed to it, then to himself, and then tapped his heart, his face etched with a pain so profound it transcended language. He needed to know. Ayanna watched him, her gaze softening with a flicker of understanding. She began her story, a tapestry woven from gestures, from sounds, from drawings of her own in the dirt. She spoke in her native tongue, the soft, flowing words painting a picture that Jebediah strained to comprehend. She drew a picture of a small girl, herself, and then a woman with long hair, her mother. She then drew a second woman, a white woman with a kind face, who was giving her mother a pouch of medicine and a loaf of bread. This kind woman, Ayanna conveyed, was named Sarah. Jebediah's breath hitched. Ayanna went on, her story turning dark. She drew figures of armed white men on horseback, not in soldiers' uniforms, attacking a peaceful camp filled with women and children. It wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. This was the event Thorn had twisted into a raid on the Miller settlement. Her people were the victims, scattered and hunted. Before her mother was killed, she had pressed the locket into Ayanna's hand, a final gift, a talisman from the kind woman who had shown them compassion years ago. As Jebediah listened, the puzzle pieces of his own past began to click into place with horrifying clarity. He remembered Sarah's charity trips, her secret visits to a small Cheyenne family camped at the edge of their old property, a family she insisted were peaceful and starving. He had been afraid, had warned her against it, blinded by the common prejudices of the time. He had been a fool. The men Thorn was hunting weren't murderers. They were the survivors of a massacre, and the locket, his Sarah's final gift, had been passed on as a symbol of hope and protection, a hope he had long since abandoned. A cold, righteous fury settled over Jebediah, displacing the grief that had been his constant companion for 2 decades. He had to see for himself. He told Ayanna he would be back, using a gesture for the sun rising twice. He rode out hard, following the directions she'd traced in the dirt, his horse eating up the miles of rugged terrain. He found the camp exactly where she said it would be, tucked into a small, hidden canyon. The scene was one of utter devastation. The charred skeletons of teepees reached to the sky like accusing fingers. The ground was littered with the detritus of destroyed lives. A child's broken doll, a scattered pile of beads, the air thick with the stench of death and decay. This was not the site of a battle. This was an execution ground. As he walked through the ashes of this destroyed community, his boot crunched on something metallic. He knelt and brushed away the dirt. It was a spent cartridge casing, different from the type used by the Cheyenne. It was from a new model of rifle, the kind favored by hired guns and ambitious lawmen. A few yards away, half buried near the cold ashes of a central fire, he saw the glint of glass. It was a whiskey flask, silver-plated and ornate. He picked it up. It felt heavy in his hand, not just with liquor, but with significance. He turned it over and his blood ran cold. Engraved on the side in elegant script were 2 initials, Mt. Marshall Thorn. The truth hit Jebediah with the force of a physical blow. Thorn hadn't been chasing raiders. He had led them. The attack on the Miller settlement, the wanted posters, all of it was a lie, a brutal, calculated deception to justify exterminating Ayanna's people. Jebediah remembered the whispers in town about the railroad wanting to survey that very canyon. Whispers of gold deposits. Thorn hadn't been delivering justice. He had been clearing the way for profit. Protecting Ayanna was no longer a simple act of sheltering a fugitive. It was now a fight against a monster wearing a tin star. Jebediah rode back to his homestead not as a grieving recluse, but as a man with a purpose. He saw Ayanna waiting for him at the fence line, her posture anxious, and for the first time he offered her a small, grim smile of reassurance. He knew what he had to do, but he also knew he was one man against a corrupt sheriff and his loyal posse. He needed help. That evening, he did something he hadn't done in 10 years. He rode to his nearest neighbor's ranch. Elias Thorn was a quiet, dour man who kept to himself, a mirror of Jebediah in many ways. Elias greeted him at the door, with a shotgun held loosely in his hand and a look of profound surprise. Jebediah, without preamble, laid the flask on the porch rail between them. "I need to talk to you," he said. He told Elias everything about Ayanna, the locket, the massacre at the canyon, and the flask. Elias listened without interruption, his face impassive. When Jebediah was finished, the silence stretched. "Thorn's been pressuring folks to sell their land cheap for months," Elias finally said, his voice a low rumble. "Told me the territory was getting too dangerous, with all the hostiles stirring up trouble." He looked at the flask, then back at Jebediah. "My wife is part Sioux. We've known for a long time that Thorn's justice only serves one color." He nodded slowly. "What do you need?" From there, they rode to the west, to the home of Martha, a widow whose husband had died in a riding accident a year prior after refusing to sell his water rights to a land company Thorn was backing. When Martha saw the flask, she didn't need any convincing. A small, resolute alliance was formed under the vast, star-dusted Wyoming sky, a bond forged not of friendship, but of shared principle and a common enemy. The reclusive settler was no longer alone. We see in these moments how the courage of one person can inspire others to stand up against injustice. If you've ever witnessed or been a part of a community coming together for the right cause, share your story in the comments. And please, subscribe to keep these stories from the heart of the West alive. Thorne's patience had run out. 2 days later, just as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and red, a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. It was Thorne and a posse of 6 men riding with grim intent. But Jebediah, Elias, and Martha were ready. They were barricaded in the cabin, rifles loaded. As Thorne's men surrounded the small homestead, the sheriff strode toward the porch. "Jebediah, it's over! Send out the murderer and we'll let you live." Jebediah stepped out onto the porch, his old rifle held steady in his hands. "The only murderer here is you, Thorne," he yelled, his voice carrying in the tense quiet. He held up the flask. "I was at the canyon. I found this." Thorne's face paled for a second before contorting into a mask of rage. "Kill him! Burn it all down!" he screamed at his men. The standoff was about to erupt into a bloodbath when a new sound reached them. The soft thrumming of unshod hooves, a sound that grew steadily into a thunderous beat. All eyes turned to the northern ridge. Silhouetted against the dying sun was a line of riders. Not ranchers, not soldiers. It was a war party of at least 30 Cheyenne warriors, their faces painted, their presence radiating a quiet, deadly power. At their lead was a formidable man, with streaks of gray in his braided hair. Thorne and his men froze, their bravado evaporating into sheer terror. Ayanna stepped out onto the porch beside Jebediah. She raised her hand and called out a name. The lead rider, her uncle Black Owl, raised his lance in response. For days, Ayanna had been using a small piece of polished silver from one of Sarah's old hand mirrors, flashing signals toward the northern hills at midday. Jebediah had seen her, but assumed it was a meaningless, idle activity. He had underestimated her completely. She had not been waiting to be rescued. She had been summoning her family. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had shattered. Trapped between the armed settlers and the Cheyenne warriors, Thorne's posse crumbled. One of the younger deputies threw down his gun. "He made us do it," the boy cried out. "He told us the Millers were dead. It was all a lie." Black Owl and his warriors dismounted, surrounding the disgraced sheriff. Jebediah walked down the steps and handed the flask to Black Owl. "This is the man who led the attack on your people." Black Owl's eyes, filled with a deep ancient sorrow, met Jebediah's. No more words were needed. Thorne's fate was sealed. In the quiet aftermath, a new chapter began for the small patch of land that had once been Jebediah's desolate sanctuary. Thorne and the men directly responsible for the massacre were taken by the Cheyenne to face their justice, a fate the rest of the community tacitly accepted as earned. The truth, once revealed, sent ripples through the territory, forcing a painful reckoning with the lies that had been so easily believed. Jebediah's homestead became a place of treaty, a neutral ground where Elias, Martha, and other ranchers would meet with Black Owl to trade and talk, slowly, painstakingly building a bridge of understanding, where before there had only been a chasm of fear. Ayanna was offered her place back among her people, a place of honor, but she chose to stay with Jebediah. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the fireflies dance, he tried to give her the locket back. "It was my wife's," he said softly, "but her spirit gave it to your mother. It belongs to you now." Ayanna took it, but instead of putting it on, she walked inside and placed it on the rough-hewn mantelpiece above the fireplace. "It belongs to this house," she said, her English slow but clear, "to the memory of a kind woman, and to our family." Jebediah looked at this young woman, who had survived so much, and saw not a Cheyenne, not a fugitive, but the daughter of his heart, a gift from the wife he had lost. In his desperate act of sheltering a stranger, he had not only unveiled a hidden past, but had found his own redemption. He hadn't just saved her life. She, in turn, had saved him from the empty prison of his grief, teaching him that family is forged in loyalty, justice is found in courage, and a home is built not with wood and stone, but with love and acceptance. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story moved you, please hit the like button and subscribe to Fireside Frontier Tales for more tales of the heart from the American West.